The blood on her hands wasn't hers, but it might as well have been for all the trouble it would cause. Hannah Rose scrubbed frantically at the basin in Mrs. Sutton's kitchen, trying to remove the crimson stains from the white tablecloth before her employer returned from town. Bannack, Montana in 1875 was no place for a woman alone, especially one with no money and fewer prospects, but Hannah was beginning to wonder if working for Edith Sutton was any better than taking her chances with the wilderness. "That'll never come out, you know," came a silky voice from the doorway. Hannah jumped, sending water splashing across her already soiled apron. Edith Sutton stood watching, her lips curled in a familiar sneer that never failed to send chills down Hannah's spine. "I suppose I'll have to dock your wages again." "But Mrs. Sutton, it was Mr. Sutton who spilled the wine," Hannah protested, immediately regretting her words as the older woman's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Are you suggesting my husband is clumsy, Miss Rose?" Edith glided across the kitchen, her expensive dress rustling against the rough wooden floor. At 45, she maintained the beauty that had once made her the toast of Boston society, before she'd married Gerald Sutton and moved west to become the most feared rancher's wife in the territory. "No, madam, I just meant, you meant to make excuses as usual." Mrs. Sutton plucked the tablecloth from Hannah's hands, examining it with exaggerated care. "This was imported from Europe. Do you know how much it cost?" Hannah swallowed hard. "No, madam, more than you'll earn in a year." She dropped the cloth back into the basin with a splash. "That's another $1 from your wages." Hannah bit her tongue, desperate to point out that her monthly wage of $8 was already pitiful, and Mrs. Sutton had found reasons to dock it down to $5 last month. At this rate, she'd never save enough to leave Bannack. "Yes, madam," she managed, looking down at her raw, red hands. "Now, clean this mess and prepare dinner. The new cattle buyer is coming tonight and everything must be perfect." Edith paused at the doorway. "And Hannah?" "Wear the blue dress I gave you. Mr. Harrington appreciates a pretty face and we need this deal." After Mrs. Sutton left, Hannah slumped against the basin. The blue dress was another of Mrs. Sutton's manipulations, too tight, too low cut, and clearly designed to display Hannah like merchandise. She was 23 years old and felt like she'd already lived a lifetime of hardship since her parents died of fever 3 years ago, leaving her with nothing but debts and their failing farm. The Suttons had seemed like salvation then, offering her work in their grand house on the outskirts of Bannack. Gerald Sutton owned the largest cattle ranch in the territory, and his wife ruled their household with an iron fist disguised in velvet gloves. It had taken Hannah less than a month to realize she'd traded one form of bondage for another, but with nowhere else to go, she endured. As she prepared the roast for dinner, Hannah heard the familiar sound of horses approaching. Through the kitchen window, she saw riders coming up the long drive to the main house. The Sutton Ranch hands rarely came this close to the house unless summoned, and these men were strangers. One rider caught her eye, tall and broad-shouldered, with a straight back that suggested he might have been a soldier once. Unlike the other men who wore the practical, dust-covered clothes of working cowboys, this man's clothes were of better quality, not fancy but well-made. His black hat shaded his face, but something about his confident posture made Hannah watch him a moment longer than the others. When Mrs. Sutton rang the bell, Hannah hurried to answer. In the entryway stood 3 men, Mr. Sutton, looking as always like he'd rather be anywhere else. A portly man Hannah assumed was the cattle buyer, Mr. Harrington, and the tall stranger she'd noticed from the window. "Hannah, take the gentlemen's hats, Mrs." Sutton ordered, giving Hannah a pointed look that said she'd noticed her wearing her regular dress, not the blue one. "This is Mr. Harrington from Chicago and his associate, Mr. Preston Shaw." Hannah bobbed a curtsy, keeping her eyes down as she collected the hats. When she reached for Mr. Shaw's, their fingers brushed and she glanced up involuntarily. His eyes were a startling blue against his sun-darkened skin, and for a moment, Hannah forgot herself, staring directly into them. "Miss," he said, with a slight nod that seemed more respectful than the usual dismissive acknowledgement she received from the Suttons' guests. "Dinner will be served in 30 minutes, Mrs. Sutton announced, breaking the moment. "Hannah, bring whiskey to the study. Gentlemen, shall we?" Hannah retreated to the kitchen, her heart inexplicably racing. There had been something in Mr. Shaw's gaze and intensity, a sharpness of assessment that made her feel both seen and exposed. As she arranged glasses on a silver tray, she told herself not to be foolish. Men like Preston Shaw didn't notice women like her, except perhaps as they might notice a piece of furniture only if it was in their way. Still, she found herself patting her hair and straightening her collar before carrying the whiskey to the study. The men were already deep in conversation as she entered. "I've got 2,000 head ready to move now," Mr. Sutton was saying, "and another 1,000 by spring." Mr. Harrington nodded, his jowls wobbling. "The price we discussed seems fair, considering the drought conditions further south have driven prices up. Fair to you, perhaps." This from Mr. Shaw, who stood by the window, looking out over the ranch. "But Sutton's cattle are prime stock, and the railroad's new spur line makes shipping more economical. They're worth 15% more, at least." Mr. Sutton looked surprised, while Mr. Harrington's face reddened. "Shaw, we agreed to make a fair assessment once we saw the stock." Mr. Shaw turned, and his eyes met Hannah's as she set down the tray. Something flickered in his expression, curiosity, perhaps, or something else she couldn't name. "The girl can pour, Mrs." Sutton said sharply, noticing his gaze. Hannah served the whiskey, aware of Mr. Shaw watching her. When she handed him his glass, he thanked her by name, which startled her enough that she nearly dropped the tray. "If you'll excuse me," Hannah murmured, backing toward the door. "Actually," Mr. Shaw said, "I was hoping to speak with Miss Rose about another matter. Mrs. Sutton, I understand she works for you directly." Edith Sutton's smile was brittle. "Hannah is our housekeeper, yes, though I can't imagine what business you would have with her." "I'm looking to hire staff for my new property," Mr. Shaw said casually. "The old Davidson place about 10 miles east." "You bought Tom Davidson's spread?" Mr. Sutton asked, surprised. "I heard he was looking to sell, but didn't know it was final. Signed the papers yesterday." "It needs work, but the location is good, and the water rights alone make it worthwhile." Mr. Shaw sipped his whiskey, then looked directly at Hannah. "I need a housekeeper who knows this area. What does Mrs. Sutton pay you, Miss Rose?" Hannah froze, her eyes darting to Mrs. Sutton, whose expression had gone dangerously cold. "I'm afraid Hannah isn't available," Mrs. Sutton said before Hannah could speak. "She's under contract." "There's no contract," Hannah found herself saying, then immediately regretted it when Mrs. Sutton's eyes narrowed to slits. Mr. Shaw raised an eyebrow. "No, then perhaps we can discuss terms. I'll double what Mrs. Sutton pays plus room and board." A startled silence fell over the room. Mr. Harrington looked uncomfortable, Mr. Sutton bewildered, and Mrs. Sutton furious. Hannah hardly dared breathe. "Mr. Shaw," Mrs. Sutton said finally, her voice tight with controlled rage, "this is hardly appropriate dinner conversation. Hannah, go finish preparing the meal, now." Hannah hurried from the room, her mind spinning. Double her wages would mean $16 a month more money than she'd ever earned. But Mrs. Sutton would never allow it, and Hannah had seen what happened to people who crossed Edith Sutton. The last girl who had displeased her had been sent away with whispers of theft following her, ensuring no one in Bannack would hire her. In the kitchen, Hannah moved mechanically, her hands completing familiar tasks while her thoughts raced. She didn't know Preston Shaw, had no reason to trust him. For all she knew, his offer might come with expectations she wasn't willing to meet. And yet, the possibility of escape dangled before her like a lifeline. Dinner was a tense affair. Mrs. Sutton dominated the conversation, steering it firmly away from any mention of Hannah or employment. Mr. Shaw seemed content to let her, focusing instead on the cattle deal, though Hannah caught him watching her several times as she served the courses. It wasn't until dessert that Mrs. Sutton made her move. "Mr. Shaw," she said, setting down her fork, "I feel I must warn you about Hannah. While she's adequate as a housekeeper, she has a history of impropriety with male employers." Hannah nearly dropped the coffee pot. "Mrs. Sutton, silence," Mrs. Sutton hissed. "The Millers dismissed her for exactly this reason before she came to us. We took pity on her despite the rumors." It was a blatant lie. Hannah had never worked for the Millers and had come directly to the Suttons after her parents' death. but Mrs. Sutton knew that her reputation for loose morals would make Hannah unemployable elsewhere, particularly by a single man like Mr. Shaw. "Is that so?" Mr. Shaw asked, his expression unreadable as he looked from Mrs. Sutton to Hannah, whose face burned with humiliation. "I have never," Hannah began, but Mrs. Sutton cut her off. "Go to your room, Hannah. We'll discuss your insolence later." Hannah stood frozen, torn between defending herself and the lifetime of conditioning that told her to obey those in authority. But something in Mr. Shaw's steady gaze gave her courage. "That's not true," she said firmly. "I came to work for the Suttons directly after my parents died. I've never been employed elsewhere, and I've never been improper with anyone." She lifted her chin. "Mrs. Sutton doesn't want me to leave because she pays me half what a housekeeper should earn and works me from dawn until midnight." The silence that followed was absolute. Mr. Harrington looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. Mr. Sutton stared at his plate, and Mrs. Sutton looked like she might actually strike Hannah right there at the table. "Well," Mr. Shaw said after a moment, "that's easily verified. Bannack isn't so large that the truth can't be uncovered." He turned to Mrs. Sutton. "Perhaps we should discuss a proper transfer of employment. I'm still prepared to pay Miss Rose twice her current wages." "Get out," Mrs. Sutton said, her voice deadly quiet. "All of you, the cattle deal is off." Mr. Harrington sputtered in protest, but Mr. Sutton put a restraining hand on his arm. "Edith, be reasonable. This is business. I said get out." Mrs. Sutton stood abruptly, sending her chair crashing backward. "And you," she turned to Hannah, "pack your things. You're dismissed without references. I want you off my property tonight." Hannah felt the blood drain from her face. Even with Mr. Shaw's offer, being dismissed without references was a serious blow, and if he changed his mind... Mrs. Sutton, Mr. Shaw said, rising slowly to his feet, "I understand you're upset, but sending a young woman out at night with nowhere to go isn't safe or reasonable." "She should have considered that before lying about me," Mrs. Sutton snapped. Hannah squared her shoulders. "I didn't lie." "Miss Rose can come with me tonight," Mr. Shaw said. "My foreman and his wife are staying at the property. She'll be properly chaperoned, and we can formalize her employment tomorrow." He looked at Hannah. "If that suits you." It was reckless, impulsive, possibly dangerous, but Hannah knew with sudden clarity that staying would be worse. "Yes," she said. "Thank you. You'll regret this," Mrs. Sutton said, her eyes boring into Hannah with pure hatred. "I doubt that very much," Hannah replied, surprising herself with her calm. "I'll get my things." It took Hannah less than 10 minutes to pack her meager belongings into a small trunk. 3 dresses, some undergarments, a worn Bible that had belonged to her mother, and a locket containing miniature portraits of her parents were all she had to show for 23 years of life. When she came downstairs, trunk in hand, she found Mr. Shaw waiting alone in the entryway. Mr. Sutton and Mr. Harrington had apparently retreated to the study, and Mrs. Sutton was nowhere to be seen. "Are you ready?" Mr. Shaw asked. In the dim light of the entryway, his features seemed softer, less imposing. "Yes," Hannah said, though her voice shook slightly. "Mr. Shaw, I'm grateful, but I want to be clear. I'm accepting a position as your housekeeper, nothing more." A flicker of surprise crossed his face, followed by what might have been respect. "Of course, Miss Rose, I assure you my offer was exactly what I stated, employment, nothing more. Mrs. Jenkins, my foreman's wife, will be pleased to have female company. She's been complaining about being surrounded by men since they arrived last week." Some of the tension left Hannah's shoulders. "Thank you." He took her trunk, leading her outside where a wagon was already waiting alongside his horse. "I came prepared to transport samples of Sutton's cattle feed," he explained, seeing her questioning look. "It seems I'm transporting something far more valuable instead." Despite everything, Hannah felt herself blush. Mr. Shaw helped her into the wagon, then mounted his horse. As they started down the long drive away from the Sutton ranch, Hannah couldn't help looking back once at the house that had been both her prison and her shelter for 3 years. "Having second thoughts?" Mr. Shaw asked quietly. Hannah shook her head, turning resolutely forward. "No," she said. "No second thoughts." The journey to the Davidson property took nearly 2 hours in the darkness. Hannah was exhausted by the time they arrived, the events of the day catching up with her. The main house was smaller than the Suttons, but well built, with a wide porch and sturdy walls. Lights glowed in the windows, and as they approached, the door opened to reveal a large man with a bushy beard and a woman with a kind, round face. "Preston, we were starting to worry," the woman called. Then, seeing Hannah, "Oh, you've brought company, Mrs. Jenkins, this is Miss Hannah Rose, my new housekeeper," Mr. Shaw said, helping Hannah down from the wagon. "Miss Rose, this is Abigail Jenkins and her husband Thomas, my foreman." "Pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Jenkins said, though her curious eyes darted between Hannah and Mr. Shaw. Come in, you must be frozen. Thomas, get her trunk." Inside, the house was warm and surprisingly welcoming, though clearly in need of a woman's touch. Mrs. Jenkins led Hannah to a small but clean bedroom, explaining that she and her husband were staying in an adjoining room until the bunkhouse renovations were complete. "Mr. Shaw's room is on the other side of the house," she added, with a meaningful look that told Hannah she understood the precariousness of a young woman's reputation. "He's a good man, miss, stern sometimes and private but fair. You won't be sorry you came." Left alone, Hannah sat on the edge of the bed, wondering if she'd made the right choice or simply traded one form of servitude for another. But as she unpacked her few belongings, she realized that for the first time in years, she felt something like hope. Morning brought revelations. The Davidson Ranch, now Shaw's Ranch, was smaller than the Suttons but beautifully situated in a valley with a clear stream running through it. The house needed work, as did the outbuildings, but Hannah could see the potential. She rose early, determined to prove her worth. By the time Mrs. Jenkins came to the kitchen, Hannah had coffee brewing and biscuits in the oven. "Well, aren't you an early bird?" Mrs. Jenkins said approvingly. "Mr. Shaw and Thomas have been up since dawn, checking fences. They'll be hungry when they return." Hannah nodded, kneading dough for bread. "Mrs. Jenkins, may I ask, how long have you known Mr. Shaw?" The older woman smiled knowingly. "Wondering what you've gotten yourself into. Thomas has worked for Preston for 5 years now. We were in Colorado before this." Preston inherited a small ranch from his uncle and built it into something substantial, then sold it to buy this place. She paused. "He's an ambitious man, but a decent one. Never known him to mistreat anyone who works honest." "And is there a Mrs. Shaw?" Hannah asked, trying to sound casual. "No, though not for lack of ladies trying," Mrs. Jenkins chuckled. "Preston keeps to himself mostly. Thomas says he was engaged once, years ago, but she died before they could marry. Influenza, I think. He doesn't speak of it." Hannah digested this information as she worked. When Mr. Shaw and Thomas Jenkins returned for breakfast, she served them efficiently, keeping her eyes down and her manner professional. If Mr. Shaw noticed her reserve, he didn't comment on it. After breakfast, he asked her to join him in what would become his office, a small room off the main parlor, currently cluttered with crates and ledgers. "Miss Rose," he began, standing rather formally behind a desk that had seen better days, "I want to clarify your position here. As I promised, I'll pay you $16 a month plus room and board. Your duties will include cooking, cleaning, laundry, and general household management. Once we're more established, we may hire additional help." "That sounds fair," Hannah said carefully. "Good, there's one other matter." He hesitated, then reached into a drawer and pulled out a small pouch. "Your first month's wages in advance. I understand you left the Suttons without what they owed you." Hannah stared at the pouch in shock. $16 was more money than she'd had at one time in years. "Mr. Shaw, I can't accept advance payment. What if I don't? What if it doesn't work out? Then you'll have the means to go elsewhere," he said simply. "I believe in paying fairly for honest work, Miss Rose. I expect you'll earn every penny." She took the pouch reluctantly. "Thank you." "I'll do my best to deserve your confidence," he nodded, his expression softening slightly. "I have no doubt of that." Then, more briskly, "Now, I'd appreciate your assessment of what the house needs. Mrs. Jenkins has been helpful, but she and Thomas will be moving to the foreman's cabin once it's repaired next week." They spent the next hour walking through the house, with Hannah making mental notes of necessary repairs and supplies. Mr. Shaw listened attentively to her suggestions, occasionally jotting things down in a small notebook. "You have a good eye," he said as they finished. "Practical." When you don't have much, you learn to make do, Hannah replied. Something flickered in his eyes, understanding, perhaps. Yes, he said quietly. You do. The next weeks fell into a pattern. Hannah rose early to prepare breakfast, then spent her days cleaning, cooking, and gradually bringing order to the house. Mr. Shaw was often gone, riding out with Thomas to inspect the property or into town on business. When present, he was polite but distant, retreating to his office in the evenings with ledgers and correspondence. Mrs. Jenkins was good company, teaching Hannah the rhythms of ranch life, which differed from what she'd known at the Suttons. There, she'd been isolated in the house. Here, she found herself part of the small but growing community of workers. By the end of her first month, Mr. Shaw had hired 3 ranch hands besides Thomas, and a young local boy named Billy to help with odd jobs. Hannah learned that Preston Shaw had plans for the ranch beyond cattle. He was experimenting with new feeding methods, had ordered special breeding stock from back east, and was negotiating with the railroad for preferential shipping rates. He's building something to last, Thomas told her one evening as they sat on the porch after dinner while Preston was in town. Man thinks 3 steps ahead of everyone else. Hannah had noticed. What she couldn't determine was where, if anywhere, she fit into those plans. Sometimes she caught Mr. Shaw watching her with an expression she couldn't decipher. Other times, he seemed hardly to notice her presence at all. Her first trip into Bannack came a month after her arrival when Mrs. Jenkins insisted Hannah accompany her to purchase supplies. "You can't hide out here forever, dear," she said kindly. "Better to face the gossip head-on." Hannah knew she was right. Leaving the Suttons as she had, then taking up residence at a bachelor's ranch, even with the Jenkins presence as chaperones would have tongues wagging in Bannack. Better to show herself respectable and unashamed. Still, she felt her stomach knot with anxiety as they drove the wagon into town. Bannack had grown since gold was discovered in the nearby hills in the 1860s, though it had settled into a more stable community once the initial rush subsided. The main street boasted a general store, a hotel, 2 saloons, a church, and assorted other businesses. Hannah kept her head high as they made their way to the general store. Inside, the whispers started almost immediately. Mrs. Miller, the banker's wife, was examining fabric when they entered. She took one look at Hannah and turned pointedly away. Mrs. Jenkins, Miss Rose. Mr. Parker, the storekeeper, greeted them with professional courtesy, though his eyes lingered curiously on Hannah. "What can I help you with today?" Mrs. Jenkins handed over their supply list while Hannah pretended not to notice the stares from the other customers. She was examining a bolt of calico when a familiar voice made her freeze. Well, if it isn't the ungrateful housekeeper. Mrs. Sutton stood at the end of the aisle, her expensive dress and elaborate hat making Hannah's simple garments seem even plainer by comparison. But Hannah noticed something she hadn't before: a hardness around Mrs. Sutton's mouth, a brittleness in her eyes that spoke of disappointment and bitterness poorly concealed beneath her veneer of superiority. "Mrs. Sutton," Hannah acknowledged with a slight nod, determined not to show fear. "I hear you've made yourself quite at home with Mr. Shaw," Mrs. Sutton said, her voice carrying deliberately. "I wonder if he knows about your sticky fingers. Several items went missing after your hasty departure." Hannah felt the blood rush to her face. "That's not true, isn't it?" "I've filed a report with Sheriff Baldwin. He may be calling on you." Mrs. Sutton smiled coldly. "Though I'd be willing to withdraw the complaint if you returned what you took." "I took nothing but what was mine," Hannah said, her voice surprisingly steady despite her racing heart. "Mrs. Sutton," Mrs. Jenkins interrupted, stepping to Hannah's side. "I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Abigail Jenkins, Mr. Shaw's foreman's wife. I've been with Miss Rose daily since she joined our household, and I can assure you she's shown nothing but the highest character." Mrs. Sutton's eyes narrowed. "You weren't there when she left our employ. Items were missing, valuable items." "What items?" came a deep voice, and Hannah turned to find Preston Shaw standing in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the bright light outside. Mrs. Sutton faltered momentarily. "Mr. Shaw, I wasn't aware you were in town." Evidently. He moved to stand beside Hannah, his presence solid and reassuring. "You've accused Miss Rose of theft. I'm asking what items were allegedly taken." Something in his tone made Mrs. Sutton reconsider her approach. "A silver letter opener," she said after a moment's hesitation. "And a brooch, family heirlooms." "Interesting," Mr. Shaw said, "because I had a most illuminating conversation with your husband yesterday. He mentioned you've been distressed about losing those very items for months well before Miss Rose left your employ." Mrs. Sutton's face flushed an ugly red. "Gerald had no right, he had every right to clear an innocent woman's name," Mr. Shaw said firmly. "Now, I suggest you withdraw your complaint with the sheriff, Mrs. Sutton, unless you'd prefer I share what else your husband told me about your household management." The threat hung in the air between them, though Hannah had no idea what it might refer to. Mrs. Sutton clearly did, however, as the color drained from her face. "This isn't over," she hissed, then turned on her heel and swept from the store, leaving a wake of whispers behind her. Hannah let out a shaky breath. "Thank you," she said quietly to Mr. Shaw. "But you didn't have to. I protect my people, Miss Rose," he said simply. Then, to Mrs. Jenkins, "Is the order nearly ready? I'd like to return to the ranch before nightfall." The ride back was quiet with Mrs. Jenkins tactfully riding up front with Mr. Parker's son, who was delivering some of their larger purchases, leaving Hannah and Mr. Shaw to follow in his wagon. "What did Mr. Sutton tell you?" Hannah finally asked, unable to contain her curiosity. Mr. Shaw glanced at her, a hint of a smile softening his usually serious expression. "That his wife has a habit of misplacing items then blaming the staff, and that he's sorry for how you were treated." "Oh," Hannah was surprised. Mr. Sutton had always seemed so dominated by his wife that she wouldn't have expected him to stand up for a former servant. "He also mentioned," Mr. Shaw continued more hesitantly, "that Mrs. Sutton was particularly hard on female staff she perceived as attractive." Hannah felt her cheeks warm. "I see. For what it's worth," he added, "I think she had reason to be concerned, though not for the reason she thought." "What do you mean?" He looked at her directly then, his blue eyes intent. "You have strength, Hannah. The kind that makes people like Edith Sutton uncomfortable, because it reminds them of what they lack." It was the first time he had used her given name, and something about the way he said it made her heart beat faster. Before she could respond, he turned his attention back to the road, the moment passing like a cloud shadow across the plains. That night, alone in her room, Hannah replayed the conversation in her mind. There had been something in Mr. Shaw's, in Preston's voice that suggested more than employer's concern. Or was she imagining it, seeing what she wanted to see? Because she couldn't deny, even to herself, that she was growing increasingly aware of him not just as her employer, but as a man. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Hannah was kneading bread dough when she heard a horse approaching. Looking out the kitchen window, she was startled to see Sheriff Baldwin dismounting in the yard. Preston emerged from the barn to greet him, and though Hannah couldn't hear their conversation, she could see it was intense. After several minutes, both men headed toward the house. "Miss Rose," Sheriff Baldwin said as he entered the kitchen, removing his hat, "I need to ask you some questions." Hannah wiped her hands on her apron, anxiety rising. "Of course, Sheriff." "It's all right, Hannah," Preston said quietly. "The sheriff is just doing his job." Sheriff Baldwin cleared his throat. "Mrs. Sutton has withdrawn her complaint against you, Miss Rose, says it was a misunderstanding." Relief washed through Hannah. "I'm glad to hear it. However," the sheriff continued, "there's been talk in town about your situation here." His eyes darted uncomfortably between Hannah and Preston. "My situation?" Hannah repeated, confusion giving way to understanding as she saw the sheriff's discomfort. "You mean Miss Rose is employed as my housekeeper with proper chaperonage," Preston said firmly. "Mrs. Jenkins and her husband have been in residence since Miss Rose's arrival and will continue to live on the property." "Yes, well." Sheriff Baldwin shifted awkwardly. "The Reverend Harris expressed concern about appearances." Hannah felt her face flame. The local minister was known for his strict views on propriety, and a young, unmarried woman living on a bachelor's ranch, even with chaperones, might raise eyebrows in conservative Bannack. Then perhaps the Reverend should offer employment to the young women in his congregation, instead of leaving them at the mercy of people like Mrs. Sutton. Hannah said, unable to contain her indignation. Hannah, Preston warned softly, but there was a gleam of approval in his eyes. Sheriff Baldwin sighed. Look, I'm not here to cause trouble, just passing along concerns. As long as everything is proper, it's no business of mine. He replaced his hat. Good day to you both. After he left, Hannah stood rigidly by the table, embarrassment and anger warring within her. I'm sorry, she said stiffly. I shouldn't have spoken so freely. If my presence is causing problems for you in town, don't, Preston interrupted. Don't apologize and don't offer to leave. What you said was entirely justified. He ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of agitation. The good people of Bannack would rather see a woman destitute than risk a hint of impropriety. It's hypocritical and cruel. Still, your reputation is my concern, not yours. He moved closer, his expression softening. Hannah, I hired you because you're capable and hardworking. I won't let small-minded gossip change that. The way he said her name with such warmth and conviction made something unfurl in Hannah's chest, a dangerous feeling, when she couldn't afford to indulge. Thank you, she said, taking a deliberate step back. I should finish the bread. He nodded, understanding her need for distance. Of course. I'll be riding out to check the north pasture with Thomas. We won't be back for dinner. After he left, Hannah pressed her floury hands against her hot cheeks, trying to calm her racing heart. This was precisely what she'd feared developing feelings for her employer. It was the oldest story in the world, and one that rarely ended well for the woman involved. But as the weeks passed, Hannah found it increasingly difficult to maintain professional detachment. Preston was unlike any man she'd known, thoughtful, intelligent, with a quiet intensity that drew her like a moth to flame. He respected her opinions, listened when she spoke, and treated her with a courtesy that went beyond mere politeness. Small moments began to accumulate, Preston bringing her wildflowers he'd found on his rides, claiming casually that they might brighten the table, his hand steadying her elbow when she stumbled on the porch steps. The way his eyes sought hers first when he returned from town with news. The ranch was thriving under his management. By late summer, he'd increased the herd, repaired most of the outbuildings, and added 3 more hands to the payroll. Hannah took pride in making the house a comfortable, welcoming place, not just for Preston, but for all who worked there. Mrs. Jenkins noted the changes with knowing eyes. He's different with you, she told Hannah one evening as they shelled peas on the porch. Lighter somehow. We work well together, Hannah said carefully. Mrs. Jenkins smiled. Is that what we're calling it? Abigail, please, he's my employer. And a good one, but he's also a man, and you're a woman, and anyone with eyes can see there's something growing between you. Hannah sighed, giving up the pretense. Even if there were, it couldn't come to anything. You heard the sheriff. The town already talks. Towns always talk, Mrs. Jenkins said dismissively. The question is, do you care more about their opinions than your own happiness? It was a question Hannah couldn't answer, not even to herself. But that night, as she lay in bed listening to the distant howl of coyotes, she admitted that Abigail was right about one thing. Her feelings for Preston had grown beyond what was proper for an employee. The real question was whether he felt the same, and if so, what either of them could do about it. The opportunity to find out came sooner than she expected. 2 days later, Preston announced he needed to make a trip to Helena for business and would be gone for nearly a week. I'd like you to accompany me, Hannah, he said over breakfast. There are household supplies we need that can't be found in Bannack, and I value your judgment. Hannah nearly choked on her coffee. To Helena, but that would be completely proper, he assured her. Mrs. Jenkins will accompany us as your chaperone, and we'll stay at the Grand Hotel, you and Mrs. Jenkins in one room, me in another. But what will people say? Hannah asked, though she was already imagining the excitement of visiting Montana's capital city. They'll say I'm a practical man who needs his housekeeper's expertise, Preston replied, a hint of amusement in his eyes. Unless you'd rather not go? No, I mean yes, I'd like to go, Hannah said quickly. I've never been to Helena. Then it's settled, we'll leave tomorrow morning. The journey to Helena took 2 full days by wagon. They camped one night under the stars, with Mrs. Jenkins maintaining a discreet but firm presence between Hannah and Preston as they sat around the campfire. Still, in the flickering light, with the vast Montana sky wheeling overhead, Hannah felt a sense of intimacy she'd never experienced before. Preston told stories of his youth in Pennsylvania, of his time in the Union Army during the war, and of his decision to come west afterward. "I couldn't settle back into ordinary life," he admitted. "Everything seemed small and constrained after what I'd seen. The West offered space to breathe, to build something new. And have you?" Hannah asked. "Built something new?" He looked at her across the fire, his eyes reflecting the flames. "I'm working on it," he said quietly. Helena was a revelation to Hannah. Though she'd grown up in Montana territory, she'd never visited its bustling capital with its grand buildings, busy streets, and cosmopolitan atmosphere. The gold rush had brought wealth and diversity to the city that Bannack, for all its history as the territory's first capital, couldn't match. The Grand Hotel was the most luxurious building Hannah had ever entered, with its polished floors, crystal chandeliers, and uniformed staff. She felt painfully out of place in her simple dress until Preston gently told her she looked perfectly lovely, making her blush to the roots of her hair. Their days were filled with errands and shopping. Preston met with bankers and business associates while Hannah and Mrs. Jenkins explored the stores, selecting linens, kitchenware, and other supplies for the ranch. In the evenings, they dined together in the hotel restaurant, where Preston insisted on treating them to the finest meals. On their third day, Preston surprised Hannah by suggesting they visit a dressmaker. "The ranch is doing well," he said. "I'd like to express my appreciation for your hard work. Mrs. Jenkins tells me you've been wearing the same 3 dresses since you arrived." "That's very generous," Hannah said hesitantly, "but it's not necessary." "Please," he said, his expression earnest. "Let me do this for you." Unable to refuse the genuine warmth in his eyes, Hannah agreed. At the dressmaker's shop, Preston instructed the modiste to create 3 new dresses for Hannah, one for everyday wear, one for church, and one suitable for social occasions, he specified. "Social occasions?" Hannah questioned afterward as they walked back to the hotel. "The governor's holding a harvest ball next month," Preston explained. "I've been invited and I'd like you to accompany me." Hannah stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. "As your housekeeper." His eyes met hers, serious and intent. "No, Hannah, not as my housekeeper." The implication hung between them, heavy with possibility. Before Hannah could respond, Mrs. Jenkins tactfully interrupted, pointing out a display in a nearby shop window. The moment passed, but Hannah carried Preston's words with her like a talisman. That evening, Mrs. Jenkins claimed a headache and retired early, leaving Hannah and Preston alone in the hotel's small parlor. For a time, they discussed practical matters, supplies ordered, business conducted, but eventually silence fell, comfortable yet charged with unspoken feelings. "Hannah," Preston finally said, setting aside the newspaper he'd been pretending to read, "there's something I need to tell you." Her heart quickened. "Yes, when I came to Bannack, it wasn't just to buy Davidson's ranch." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "I came looking for you, for me," Hannah repeated, bewildered. "But you didn't know me, I knew of you." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she now recognized as a sign of nervousness. "My sister Martha lives in Miles City. She's friends with a woman named Clara Bennett, who was visiting relatives in Bannack last year." Clara mentioned meeting a young woman working for the Suttons who reminded her of Martha, intelligent, capable, but trapped in circumstances not of her making. Hannah struggled to process this. "Mrs. Bennett, the doctor's wife, she came to dinner once. We barely spoke." "Long enough for her to form an impression," Preston said. "When I mentioned I was considering property in Montana, Martha suggested Bannack and told me Clara's story about you. She thought I might help." "So you came to the Suttons that night too? What, rescue me?" Hannah felt a confusing mix of emotions: gratitude, embarrassment, and something like disappointment. "Out of charity, no," Preston said firmly. "I came out of curiosity initially, but when I saw how Mrs. Sutton treated you, how you held yourself with dignity despite it, I wanted to offer you an alternative. The ranch needed a housekeeper regardless, but I never expected—" "What?" Hannah prompted when he hesitated. "I never expected to care for you as I've come to do," he finished quietly. Hannah's breath caught. "Preston." You don't need to say anything, he assured her quickly. I understand your position is complicated. I'm your employer, and you've had enough of being under someone else's control. The last thing I want is for you to feel obligated or pressured. That's not what I feel, Hannah said, finding her courage. Not at all, hope kindled in his eyes. No, no, she took a deep breath. I care for you too, Preston, very much, but I'm afraid that if we acknowledge this feeling between us, I'll lose the independence I've only just found. And afraid of what others will say, that they'll think I've simply traded one form of servitude for another. Preston moved to sit beside her, taking her hands in his. Hannah, the last thing I want is to constrain your freedom. You've shown me that a true partnership, is worth more than any traditional arrangement where one person holds power over another. Is that possible, for a man and woman to truly be partners in this world? I don't know, he admitted, but I'd like to try if you would. The sincerity in his voice, the warmth of his hands around hers, the respect in his eyes all combined to wash away Hannah's doubts. Slowly, she nodded. Yes, she whispered. I'd like that too. He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Then we'll find our way together. The rest of their time in Helena took on a dreamlike quality for Hannah. Though nothing improper occurred, Mrs. Jenkins made quite sure of that there was a new openness between her and Preston. They spoke of their hopes for the future, of the ranch's potential, of the life they might build together. On their last evening, Preston presented Hannah with a small box. Inside lay a simple silver pendant on a delicate chain. It's not an engagement ring, he clarified as she gasped. Not yet. I want to court you properly, Hannah, but I wanted you to have something to remind you of my commitment to you, whatever form our relationship takes. She let him fasten the necklace around her throat, his fingers warm against her skin. It's beautiful, she whispered, touching the pendant that now rested just below her collarbone. Thank you. The journey back to Bannack seemed to pass in half the time, filled as it was with newfound joy and tentative plans. Yet as they approached the ranch, reality began to intrude on Hannah's happiness. What would the Hands think? How would the townspeople react? Most importantly, how would she and Preston navigate the transition from employer and employee to whatever they were becoming? Her worries must have shown on her face, for Preston reached across the wagon seat to squeeze her hand reassuringly. One day at a time, he murmured. We'll figure it out together. The ranch welcomed them back with comforting familiarity. Thomas had kept everything running smoothly in their absence, and the Hands respectfully tipped their hats to Hannah as she supervised the unloading of their purchases. If anyone noticed the new warmth between her and Preston, they didn't comment on it. That evening after dinner, Preston asked Hannah to join him for a walk. They strolled together toward the creek that ran through the property, the September air crisp with the promise of autumn. I've been thinking, Preston said as they stood watching the water flow over smooth stones. About what you said in Helena, about people thinking you traded one form of servitude for another. Hannah nodded, her hand instinctively going to the silver pendant. I don't care what people think, not really, but I care about the truth of us, about building something real, not just convenient. Exactly, he turned to face her fully. Which is why I think you should resign as my housekeeper. Hannah's heart plummeted. What? No, wait, he caught her hands, his expression earnest. I didn't mean leave the ranch, I meant change your position. The ranch is doing well enough to hire a proper staff. You could oversee them if you wanted, or pursue something else entirely. You mentioned once that your mother taught you bookkeeping. Relief flooded Hannah, followed by a surge of possibility. Are you offering me a new job, Mr. Shaw? She asked, a teasing note entering her voice. I'm offering you the freedom to choose, Miss Rose, he replied with equal playfulness. Then more seriously, I want you in my life, Hannah, but I want you there as a woman who's chosen her own path, not one who feels bound by circumstances. Hannah felt tears prick her eyes at the depth of understanding in his words. I don't deserve you, she whispered. You deserve far more than me, he countered, but I'm selfish enough to hope you'll settle for what I can offer. She laughed then, a sound of pure joy. And what is that exactly? In answer, he cupped her face gently in his hands and lowered his lips to hers. The kiss was tender, questioning at first, then deepening as Hannah responded with a passion that surprised even herself. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily. "That," Preston said hoarsely, "and a lifetime to discover the rest together." Hannah's path to independence proved both challenging and rewarding. With Preston's encouragement, she took over the ranch's account books, discovering an aptitude for business that surprised everyone except Preston himself. "You see patterns where others see only numbers," he told her admiringly after she identified a discrepancy in their cattle sales that saved them a considerable sum. They hired a cook from town, a widow named Mrs. Callahan, who was grateful for the position and the small cabin Preston had built for her near the main house. Hannah moved into a larger room on the opposite side of the house from Preston's, a compromise that maintained propriety while acknowledging their evolving relationship. The town's reaction to their courtship was predictably mixed. Some, like Sheriff Baldwin, merely nodded knowingly as if they'd expected nothing less. Others, particularly those who'd been friendly with the Suttons, were openly disapproving. Mrs. Sutton herself made a point of cutting Hannah dead when they encountered each other in town. Hannah found she didn't mind. The woman's spite seemed petty and distant now, like a storm long past. Reverend Harris proved more problematic. When Preston and Hannah attended church together for the first time, the minister's sermon focused pointedly on the dangers of worldly temptation and improper relationships. Several congregants glanced uncomfortably in their direction, though many others made a point of greeting them warmly after the service. "Ignore him," advised Mrs. Jenkins, who had become Hannah's closest friend and staunchest ally. "He'll find some other poor soul to torment once he sees you're not easily cowed." She was right. As autumn deepened into winter, the gossip gradually subsided. Preston's fair business practices and Hannah's genuine kindness won over many who had initially been skeptical. By the time snow blanketed the ranch in December, their courtship had become an accepted fact of Bannack life. The governor's harvest ball, postponed due to an early blizzard, was finally held in mid-December. Hannah wore the special dress Preston had commissioned in Helena, a deep green velvet that complemented her auburn hair and made her feel more beautiful than she'd ever thought possible. "You're staring," she told Preston self-consciously as they prepared to leave. "I can't help it," he replied simply. "You take my breath away." The ball was everything Hannah had imagined and more. Held in the grand mansion that served as the governor's residence, it brought together the territory's most prominent citizens in a swirl of music, light, and celebration. Hannah, who had never attended such an event, felt momentarily overwhelmed by the splendor. "Just remember," Preston whispered as he guided her into the ballroom, his hand warm at the small of her back. "Most of these people have just as many doubts as you. They're simply better at hiding them." His words gave her courage, and soon Hannah found herself enjoying the evening. Preston introduced her to business associates, government officials, and their wives, proudly referring to her as "my partner, Miss Rose." Some raised eyebrows at the unconventional description, but none could deny the obvious regard in which Preston held her when they danced, moving together to the strains of a waltz. Hannah felt as though she were floating. "I never dreamed of this," she admitted, looking up into Preston's eyes. "Any of it? What did you dream of?" he asked curiously. She considered the question. "Safety," she said finally. "Enough food, a warm place to sleep, the chance to make my own decisions." She smiled. "My dreams were small. And now they're bigger," she said softly, "because of you." His arm tightened around her waist, drawing her imperceptibly closer. "Tell me. I dream of building something lasting, of making a difference not just for myself but for others. She hesitated, then continued bravely, of a family someday, children who would never know the fear I did." "Hannah," Preston said, his voice rough with emotion, "will you marry me?" She stumbled slightly, missing a step in the dance. "What, here now?" he laughed, guiding her smoothly back into the rhythm. "Yes, here, yes, now. I've been carrying a ring in my pocket for weeks, waiting for the right moment, but I'm realizing there is no perfect moment, only perfect certainty. And I am absolutely certain that I want you as my wife." Hannah felt tears spring to her eyes, even as joy bubbled through her veins like champagne. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, Preston, I'll marry you. As the dance ended, Preston led her to a quiet corner of the ballroom and withdrew a small velvet box from his pocket. Inside was a ring far more elaborate than Hannah would have chosen for herself, a diamond surrounded by smaller sapphires that matched Preston's eyes. "It was my mother's," he explained as he slipped it onto her finger. "I had it reset for you." "It's beautiful," Hannah whispered, watching the stones catch the light. "But Preston, are you sure? I'm still just a housekeeper from nowhere. You could marry anyone. I don't want anyone," he interrupted firmly. "I want you, Hannah Rose, your strength, your kindness, your remarkable mind. Everything that makes you who you are." She raised herself on tiptoe and kissed him, not caring who might see. "Then I am yours," she said against his lips, "as you are mine." News of their engagement spread quickly through Bannack. Most reactions were positive, though a few, predictably, were not. Mrs. Sutton was overheard in the general store declaring that the girl has clearly trapped him and he's fool enough to let her. The comment got back to Hannah, who surprised herself by laughing. "If she only knew," she told Abigail, "that he came to Bannack looking for me. I suppose that makes him the trapper, not the trapped." They set the wedding date for April, when the harsh Montana winter would have given way to spring. Hannah threw herself into preparations, determined that their marriage would begin as she hoped it would continue with thoughtfulness, joy, and attention to detail. Preston, meanwhile, had his own surprise in the works. Without telling Hannah, he purchased the adjoining property to expand the ranch. The land included a waterfall and a beautiful meadow that Hannah had once mentioned reminded her of a place her parents had taken her as a child. "I thought," he told her when he finally revealed the purchase in March, "that we might build a new house there. Something we designed together, just as we're building our life together." Hannah was overwhelmed by the gesture. "Preston, it's too much." "Nothing is too much for you," he said simply. "Besides, it's a sound business investment. The expanded water rights alone make it worthwhile." She laughed, recognizing his attempt to disguise sentimentality as practicality. "Well, in that case, how could I object?" As their wedding day approached, Hannah found herself increasingly reflective. She thought often of her parents, wishing they could have known Preston, could have seen the woman she'd become. On one such evening, sitting by the fire in the parlor while Preston worked on ranch ledgers, she voiced this regret aloud. Preston set aside his work and moved to sit beside her on the sofa. "Tell me about them," he said, taking her hand. "I'd like to know the people who raised such an extraordinary daughter." Hannah smiled through sudden tears. "My father was a dreamer," she said. "Always planning the next improvement to our farm, the next invention that would make our fortune. My mother was the practical one, keeping us fed and clothed while his dreams sometimes outpaced his abilities, but they loved each other completely. Even when times were hardest, I never doubted that." "They sound remarkable," Preston said gently. "They were ordinary," Hannah corrected, "but what they built together was remarkable. 25 years of partnership, of facing each challenge side by side." She squeezed his hand. "That's what I want for us, Preston. Not grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but the steady, everyday certainty that we're facing life together." "We will," he promised. "Every day for all the days we have." Their wedding, held in the small church in Bannack, was simple but beautiful. Hannah wore a dress of ivory satin with lace at the collar and cuffs, another gift from Preston, but one she'd helped design. Mrs. Jenkins served as her matron of honor, while Thomas stood with Preston. To Hannah's surprise, many townspeople attended, including some who had initially been critical of their relationship. Even Sheriff Baldwin came, looking uncomfortable in his Sunday best, but offering sincere congratulations. Most shocking of all was the appearance of Gerald Sutton, who arrived alone just as the ceremony was beginning. He sat quietly at the back of the church, and afterward approached the couple with uncharacteristic diffidence. Mrs. Shaw, I should say," he began awkwardly. "I wanted to wish you both happiness and to apologize for much that happened at our house." Hannah, moved by his evident sincerity, impulsively took his hand. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Sutton. It means a great deal," he nodded, clearly relieved by her graciousness. "Edith and I. We're separating. She's returning to Boston." He glanced at Preston. Your example, the way you treat your wife, as a partner rather than a possession, it made me realize how wrong things have been. Too late for us, perhaps, but not too late to try to live more honorably." After he left, Preston looked at Hannah with wonder. "You continue to amaze me," he said. "That was a kindness he didn't deserve." "Everyone deserves kindness," Hannah replied, "even those who haven't shown it themselves, perhaps especially them." Their wedding night was everything Hannah had shyly hoped for: tender, passionate, and unmarred by the fear or shame that so many women were taught to expect. Preston was patient and gentle, guiding her through unfamiliar sensations until pleasure overwhelmed her uncertainty. Afterward, lying in his arms, Hannah felt a sense of completion she'd never known before. "I love you," she whispered against his chest, saying the words that had been in her heart for months. "And I love you," he replied, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. Today, tomorrow, and all the days after. Life as Preston Shaw's wife was not without challenges. Running a ranch in Montana Territory required constant vigilance against weather, predators, disease, and occasionally human threats. The first year of their marriage brought a severe drought that threatened their cattle, followed by an early winter that nearly depleted their feed stores. Yet through it all, Preston kept his promise. He and Hannah faced each challenge as partners, making decisions together, respecting each other's strengths and compensating for each other's weaknesses. The hands quickly grew accustomed to taking orders from Mrs. Shaw as readily as from their boss. Hannah never did return to housekeeping, instead taking over the business aspects of the ranch while Preston handled the day-to-day operations. She developed a system of accounting that tracked not just their expenses and income, but projected future needs based on weather patterns and market trends. Several neighboring ranchers adopted her methods, and soon Hannah found herself with a small side business advising other ranch wives on financial management. "You could have been a banker in another life," Preston teased her one evening as she worked on their quarterly projections. "In another life, perhaps," she agreed, "but I prefer this one." Their first child, a son they named James after Preston's father, arrived just over a year after their wedding. Hannah's labor was long and difficult, but the moment they placed the squalling, red-faced infant in her arms, she knew every pain had been worthwhile. Preston was transformed by fatherhood, his natural reserve melting away as he spent hours with his son, telling him stories, showing him the ranch, instilling in him from the earliest age the values of hard work, honesty, and respect for all. 2 years later, Hannah gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl they named Thomas and Margaret, after Preston's brother who had died in the war and Hannah's mother. The house was suddenly full of noise, chaos, and more love than Hannah had ever imagined possible. Through it all, she and Preston maintained the partnership that had been the foundation of their relationship from the beginning. They disagreed sometimes, argued occasionally, but never went to bed angry or allowed resentments to fester. "The secret," Preston told a young ranch hand who was about to get married, "is to remember that you're on the same side, even when it doesn't feel like it." By the time their eldest was 5, the new house by the waterfall was complete. It was larger than the original ranch house, with enough bedrooms for their growing family, a study for Hannah's business work, and a library filled with the books Preston had been collecting since their engagement. "One for each week we've been married," he explained when Hannah expressed amazement at the collection. "I want our children to grow up surrounded by stories and ideas, just as they're surrounded by love." The expansion of the ranch continued as well. Preston's innovative breeding programs produced cattle that were hardier and more resistant to the harsh Montana winters, while Hannah's financial management ensured they weathered market fluctuations that bankrupted less prudent ranchers. They became respected figures in Bannack and beyond. Preston was elected to the territorial legislature, where he advocated for fair treatment of small ranchers and farmers. Hannah established a foundation that provided loans to women looking to start businesses in the territory, remembering her own desperate situation before Preston came into her life. 10 years after their wedding, they hosted a celebration at the ranch that brought together friends, employees, and neighbors. As Hannah looked around at the gathered crowd, her 3 children playing with the Hands children, Preston deep in conversation with Thomas Jenkins, Mrs. Callahan proudly serving her famous apple pies, she was struck by how far they had come from that fateful night at the Sutton ranch. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Shaw," Preston asked, coming to stand beside her on the porch. "I was just thinking about the night we met," Hannah said, leaning against him as his arm encircled her waist. "When you said you'd double what Mrs. Sutton paid me," he chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her side. "Best business decision I ever made." Was that all it was? A business decision? Preston turned her to face him, his expression serious despite the teasing that had preceded it. "No," he said softly. "It was the moment my life truly began, though I didn't know it then." He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch as tender as it had been on their wedding night. "Thank you for taking a chance on me, Hannah Rose Shaw." "Best decision I ever made," she replied, echoing his words with a smile that came from the deepest part of her heart. As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Hannah thought about the lonely, frightened young woman she had been, scrubbing wine stains from tablecloths and fearing for her future. That woman could never have imagined this life, this love, these children, this home built on mutual respect and partnership. She had once told Preston her dreams were small, but he had shown her that dreams, like love, could grow when given room and nourishment. Together, they had built something far greater than either could have created alone, a life of purpose, joy, and abiding love that would echo through generations to come.